Today's daf is daf Ayin Zayin, and we start with the Mishnah. As an introduction to the Mishnah, let's just mention that if a Kohen violates an Isur Bias Kahuna, meaning he has a relationship with a Zona or a Grusha or a Chalola, any of the Isurei Kahuna, then the child from such a marriage is a Chalol in the case of a Zachar, and a chalol in the case of a nekeva. The word chalol, of course, is milashon chilul, which means to undo, or shall we say, to violate and cancel kedushas kahuna, to be machal, to desecrate. Oh, that's the word. To desecrate kedushas kahuna. Bas chalol zachar psula min hakuna li olam. Chalolus is passed through the male, meaning if he's a chalol, so he's a Kohen chalol, and he passes on his psul of chalolus liolam, meaning through all generations. The Gemara is going to try to be medayik for the word liolam, and that means that chalolus is passed through the male. However, Yisrael shenasa chalola, and there's no violation in that marriage. It's a perfectly legitimate marriage. For Yisrael is allowed to marry a chalola. Why not? And therefore, the bito kshera lekahuna. There's no chalolus that's passed on in this case, because, as we said before, chalolus passes through the male, through the father, and not through the female, through the mother. And to add to boot that there's no violation of any sort of Isur here in the case of Yisrael who marries a Chalola, and therefore there's no Chalolas that's passed on to the next generation. Chol shenasa bas Yisrael, on the other hand, in the case where, as we said earlier, the male or the father is a Chalol, even though he married a Bas Yisrael, which is perfectly legitimate, there's no violation. Nevertheless, the Bas is Psula Kahuna because, as we said before, the Chalolus from the Zachar is passed on throughout the generations. So Ad Kan HaKofa Aleph, this is the first part of the Mishnah. The balance of the Mishnah is going to record a three-way Machlokes Tanoim with regard to the relationship between Kahuna and Gerus. And the most machmir shita, the first on the list, is Rabbi Yehuda Omer Bas Ger Zochar Kibas Cholol Zochar. In other words, if a ger, a male convert, marries anyone, it doesn't matter who he marries, then the daughter of that relationship is a cholol. And that's the shita of Rabbi Yehuda, that in a case of a ger zachar, his child is going to be a cholol, is going to be excluded from kahuna. So that even if a ger married a woman who is a Bas Yisrael, and there's no violation in that marriage, obviously, because a ger can marry a Bas Yisrael, nevertheless, the daughter of such a marriage is excluded from kahuna. Now, in the case, as Rashi points out here, the daughter of a female giores who married Israel. So we're flipping it around. Instead of the ger marrying a Bas Yisrael, it was a Gioris who got married to a Ben Yisrael, an Ish Yisraeli. The daughter of such a relationship, even according to Rabbi Yehuda the Machmir, is not a Chalola. She's allowed to marry a Kohen. Now again, Rashi emphasizes that we're talking about a case of a Gioris who married a Yisrael and not a Kohen, because if a Kohen marries a Gioris, then that's, as we said before, the children are Chalolim. So basically, to some, Rabbi Yehuda's shita is that since there's gerus here, and there's going to be a disqualification of a ger as far as kahuna is concerned to generate chalolus through the son. So it's son after son after son, starting all the way on top with a ger. However, Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov Omer, that's going to be the middle shita here, that Yisrael shenasa giores bitok sher lekahuna. In the case of Yisrael, who marries a giores, the bas is not a chalola. For ger shenasa bas Yisrael, however, here's where Rabbi Eliezer disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda, and he says that if a ger marries a bas Yisrael, then bitok sher lekahuna. And as we said before, whereas Rabbi Yehuda was machmir in this case because the father is a ger, and that passes on chalolos throughout the generations, but Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov never accepted that principle. And when is gerus a problem for kahuna? That's only aval ger shenasa gioris. If both the father and the mother are gerim, so that there's no real lineage here in the offspring that connects to Yisrael, the genealogy of Yisrael. Or, for example, another identical example would be Echad Ger V'Echad Avodim Mishuchrorin, because an Eved Mishuchar also has the status of a Ger, is Afilu Ad Asora Doros, Ad Shetei Imo Yisrael. So we're going to pass on the status of a psul kahuna, that we said before, bito psul kahuna for the generations, because again, both parents are gerim, ad shetehei imo Yisrael, unless either father or the mother is a Yisrael. It means has lineage that goes back. However, that's only in a case where one of the parents is neither a ger nor a descendant of a ger. But Rabbi Yossi is the most mekil here. And he holds af ger shenasa geros. Even if both parents are gerim and there's no lineage that goes through Yisrael, bitok sher lakuna, there's no chalos whatsoever. Now the Gemara is going to focus on the extra wordly olam in the Mishnah. Ma'ili olam. The Mishnah has already indicated that chalolos will pass from one generation to the next through the father who's a chalol, and it seems to be totally redundant or unnecessary to add the word liolam. And the Gemara has a strange havamina here. If not for the word liolam, the Torah says with regard to mitzvah avadoni that dar shlishi avo heina, that in the third generation after conversion, they enter into Klal Yisrael's malahalan leachar shlosha doros afkan nami leachar shlosha doros. We might think that here also the Torah would be matir after 3 doros. So the grandson of a chol would not be a chol. Kamash malon. The Mishnah therefore adds the word liolam lafuke to exclude such a havamina, and in truth, the psul of chalolos through the male is going to be transmitted through all the generations, way past the 3rd generation. Now, the Mishnah said that Yisrael shenasa chalola, if a Yisrael marries a chalola, which again, as we said before, is a perfectly legitimate marriage, and since the chalolos here is on the female side, therefore it's not passed on to the next generation, minani mili. How do we know this? Amar Rab Yochanan be Mishum Rab Shimon, and now we have a Gzeira Shava. And this Gzeira Shava is going to combine the Parsha of Chalolos together with the Parsha of Tuma be Misas Ishto. And what does that mean? Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shimon. Nemar Khan, here in the parsha of Chalos, it says, V'lo yichal zaro bi'amav, and we should emphasize the word bi'amav, and this is, by the way, a reference to a Kohen Gadol who got married to an almana, who's forbidden to him, and he's mechal his zera, because the marriage itself is an iser kuhuna, that generates a psul chalos. But v'ner lahalon, we have another parsha, and this parsha is also in Vayikra Chav Beis, at the beginning of Parshas Emor, and it addresses the question of a Kohen who lost one of his close relatives, in this case his wife, and is he mitame to her? And in that pasuk it says, Lo yitame bal bi'amav, that the husband, who's a Kohen, is enjoined from burying his wife because he would be machalel his kedushas kahuna by doing so, and a Kohen is enjoined from tumas mes. So it means that the husband is going to have to leave it for somebody else to bury his wife. And the emphasis here at the end of the pasuk, for our purposes of Exeris Shav, is the word bi'amav. Now, what does the word bi'amav mean in Pshuto Shal Mikra? It's a very important halacha here. Bi'amav means let someone else bury his wife. But what if there's no one else to bury his wife? Then he himself is obligated to be machal his kedushas kahuna, as if she were one of the other 6 relatives, for the sake of burying his wife. But we're using the word bi'amav here for Exeris Shava. So that halacha, which regard to when a Kohen, under what circumstances he's mitame l'ishto, l'kfurasa, is not directly germane to our discussion here. What do we derive from this bi'amav Exeris Shava? Malahalin zechar v'lo nekevos. This reference to Tumah, which means that a Kohen is enjoined from being mitame to a mess, only applies to a male Kohen. It does not apply to a bas Kohen, what we call a Kohenes, is afkan zachar v'lo nekevos. Here too, when the Torah says lo yichal zaro, and zaro means that the psul of chalos is passed down through the zera, through the generations. That's only through the males and not through the females, just like bi'amav in the case of Tumas Kohen only refers to a Kohen who's a male. So the Gemara now objects. Elameata, according to your logic, bito shel Kohen Gadol tishtere. Supposing a Kohen Gadol has a relationship with an almana, violating the Isur Lav and the Chiyuv Malkus of having a relationship Kohen Gadol with an almana, then we know that the daughter of such a marriage relationship is a chalola, and she cannot marry a Kohen. Why is that so? We should be matir, allow her to marry a Kohen, because according to Gzeir Shava, even a daughter who's born from a forbidden marriage should not be a chalola, because again, as we said before, lo yichal zaro only applies to the zera zachar, as we derive it from Tumas Kohen in the parsha of Emor through the Gzeir Shava B'yama. And the Gemara answers the following: Miksiv b'no, it doesn't say lo yechalel b'no bi'amav, but rather it says zaro. And the word zaro, which includes male and female as offspring, lo yechal zaro ba'amav. That means that he will passel through this illegitimate marriage, in the case of a Kohen Gadol marrying an almana, even his female offspring, his daughters. So therefore, the Gzeir Shava, which teaches us that the descendants of a Kohen who's a female, meaning a Bas Kohen, are permitted, that applies to subsequent generations, but not to his daughter. So the Gemara asks, so Bas B'no Tishtere. Well, according to your understanding of the Gzeir Shava, what about the grandchildren? Meaning, if his son, who's a chalal, again, in the case of a son of a Kohen Gadol married to an almana, then the daughter of that son, the granddaughter, should be mutter, because we said that the Gzera teaches us that with regard to female descendants, except for the first generation, which is a daughter, they are permitted. And our Mishnah says that the daughter of a chalal is disqualified. And yet she's the granddaughter of the original bias Iser kahuna that was violated by the Kohen Gadol and the Albana. And the Gemara says, Ksiv lo yichalel zaro, makish zaro lo, zaro in the possessive gives us a comparison between the Kohen Gadol, who had this illicit, illegitimate relationship with an almana, and his zera, which means mahu bito psula, af bino bito psula. So the Gemara again raises the fine question: bas bito titaser. Okay, if you're saying that the daughter of his son is psula, then the daughter of his daughter should likely be psula. And the Gemara answers in Cain, Gzera Shava Maya Hanile. Then there would be no substance to the Gzera Shava. The Gzera Shava has to teach us something by limiting it to the males and excluding the females. So therefore, even if the daughter of his daughter is forbidden, the Gzera Shava, which teaches us that female descendants are permitted, is going to be an empty set. There would be no derivation from this Gzera Shava, and that cannot be true. Gzera Shava has to teach something, and in this case, it's going to teach us that the psul chalolos for generations to come is going to only apply to his son and not to his daughter. And even though his daughter herself will be psula, and that we derived again from the fact that the Torah says zaro, but nevertheless, the children of the daughter, meaning through the chalolos on the female side, are going to be permitted. That's what we derive from the Gzera Shava, and therefore in the third, the grandchildren generation, it will be mutter through the daughter. The Mishnah says, Chalol shenasa bas Yisrael bito psula. So we have a case of a legitimate marriage. There's nothing prohibited about this marriage. A chalol is allowed to marry bas Yisrael, but as we said over and over again, chalolos is passed through the male, through the father. Frekta Gemara, Hatanale Reisha. We already learned this in the Reisha of the Mishnah. It says, Bas chol zachar psulim min hakuna liolam. As we explained before, when we learned the Mishnah, there's a repetition in the Mishnah. And the Gemara answers, Aidi the Tana Reisha Yisrael shenasa chalola, Tana nami sefer chol shenasa bas Yisrael. So the truth is that the extra clause in the Mishnah is totally redundant and unnecessary, but we have a principle called Aidi the Tana, which means there's a literary rule of symmetry, and to make sure that the sefer is symmetrical with the reisha, therefore it adds the chol shenasa bas Yisrael bito psula. The Gemara says the following: Masnisin de lo k'Rabbi Dostoi ben Yehuda. Our Mishnah that establishes that the daughter of a chalal is not allowed to marry a Kohen is not universally accepted. Tisanya, we learned in the Brisa, Rabbi Dostoi ben Yehuda Omer, Kishem shebnei Yisrael mikveh tara l'chalolos, kach benos Yisrael mikveh tara l'chalolim, which means that if a chalal marries a bas Yisrael, then the child is not going to be a chalal. So Rabbi Dostoi ben Yehuda is rejecting the principle of that Mishnah that the psul chalolos passes on from one generation to the other generation through the zachar. On the contrary, if he marries a bas Yisrael, then that's like a purification process, almost like a mikveh tara. And the daughter of this marriage is going to be muteris l'kohen. She's not a chalola. And the chol who marries a Bas Yisrael, the daughter is permitted. My time of the Rav Dostoy or Rav Yehuda, where does he derive this? Gomer kro lo yichal zaro bi'amav. And once again, we're emphasizing the word bi'amav. Bi'am echad hu de biyachel b'shnei amamim leino miyachel. In other words, bi'am echad indicates a certain equation between the Baal and the Isha. In this case, they are both chalolim. He's a chol and she's a chalola. So if a chol marries a chalola, then he desecrates his generations, his offspring. But b'shnei amin, if one of the two, and it matters not which one is a chol, but the other one is not a chol, then mikvah taro lechalol. Okay, now the Gemara goes on to address the question of a woman. This is going to be a machlokas abayvarav. A woman who is prohibited from marrying a Kohen, but she didn't marry the Kohen. She only had an intimate relationship with the Kohen. Tan Rabbanon, we learned to the Brayso lo yechalel zaro ein li elazaro hi atzma minol. How do we know that the bia between a Bas Yisrael and an Iser Kahuna would itself passel her? In other words, let's say, for example, she would have bia with a Kohen Gadol, and she's an almana. An almana is allowed to marry a Kohen Hedja. Henceforth, she becomes asura to a Kohen Hedja because she becomes a chalola through the bia itself. And the Brisa derives this from a logical kavachomer. Amr kavachomer ma zaro shelo over aver mischalel hisha over avera in addition to mischalelis. The zera nebach are guiltless. They never did anything wrong, but since the bia was an Iser Kahuna, therefore the child is a chalol. And then how much more so, she herself, who did the avera, she has to become a chalol. It's not logical to say that she remains in a status as an almonus muteris l'kohen, which would mean that if the Kohen Gadol dies, etc., she's allowed to marry a Kohen, when she herself violated this avera as an almonus l'kohen Gadol. Or for that matter, any violation of an Iser Kahuna. Now, let me just take a moment of your time, if I can, to think twice about this Kal Vachomer. I mean, the Kal Vachomer is based on the fact that a Kohen is Mechalel his Zera. Yeah, I understand that a Kohen is Mechalel his Zera by virtue of the fact that the Zera was born to an Iser, to a Bias Iser Kahuna. But to derive conclusions about a Bas Yisrael, I don't see the logical, compelling logic here. But let's take a look at the Gemara. The Gemara is also unsure about this Kal Vachomer, but in the language of the Gemara, it's Hu Atzmo Yochiach Sha'avar Aver V'Eino Mischala. The Gemara says that there's an inherent flaw in the Kal Vachomer, because what about the Boel, shall we say the Kohen Gadol, who had a relationship with an almana? He gets malchus for that. He violated Iser Kahuna Doraisa with a lav and malchus, but he doesn't become a chalol. So we see that the aver itself doesn't generate chalolos. Chalolos is in the zera, not in the ma'aseh bia. And therefore to say that she herself, because she had a bias Iser with a Kohen, therefore she becomes a chalola, that's not so. And the Gemara rejects this pircha. Ma lehu shekein ein mischal b'chol makom tomar behi shemischaleles b'chol makom. There's no comparison here to a Kohen. He himself does not become a chalol to be mechal as kedushas kahuna in any situation. there's no situation in which the Kohen, even he's intimate with a Zona, a Chalola, a Grusha, a Giores, whatever it might be, a Shivcha, he doesn't become a Chol. Masha Einkein, in the case of a woman, unlike a Kohen, a woman is liable to become Psula Lakuna through an act of Bia. For example, she can become a Zona. So, for example, if an Isha, Bas Yisrael, would have a relationship, an intimacy with a Kusi, with a Cholol, with a Nasin, with a Mamzer, she becomes Mechulelis Lakuna. She can no longer marry a Kohen. And the Gemara in Yevamos on Daf Samach Ches Amud Beis derives this from Psukim in the Torah, that a woman who has a Bias Isur may not marry a Kohen. So therefore, the compelling logic of the Kal V'chomer is absolutely 100% tight, and there's no room for a pircha here. It's reasonable to assume that since a woman becomes disqualified through Bia, she becomes disqualified here also in this case of the Avera of Bias Kahuna. So now, at this point, the Gemara wants to offer another possible answer to the question of Minani Milu. How do we know that she herself becomes a Chalol? Instead of the Kal V'chomer, which again was a little bit questionable, we have Im Nafshecha Lomar, which means intimating some sort of a Pericho, which the Gemara is going to pick up later on. Homar Kra. Alternatively, the Torah says Lo Yichal Zar'o, and we could also read it as if it says Lo Yichulo, and that means that although Yechalel means Yachel, which means that the Torah could have dropped the Lamed, so the double Lamed here is going to be a ribui. And we could read it as Yechulal, becoming Mechulal. I think that's called Nifal. And the Gemara assumes that the Yechulal applies to the woman. Why? Because the child who's born never had the sanctity of a Kohen. So to say Yechulal, that there was a desecration of that sanctity, doesn't make any sense. But rather, Yechulal is a reference to the mother who had sanctity and now she lost it. Zeh shahaya kosher v'nischala. Gemara asks, what was the flaw in the Kal V'chomer? V'chi tema ikol emifrach. We could slug it up by saying, Ma'azaro sheken yitzirasa ba'avera. Maybe the reason for the Chalos is because from the moment he's born, he was created as a result of an Avera, therefore he's a Chalol. He never ever had Kedushas Kahuna in his life, not for a second. Omakra, and the Torah says, Lo yichal, lo yichul, zesha yakosher nischal. So the Gemara says that to say that a woman becomes a Chalola through a Bias Isur cannot be derived from a Kal V'chomer, because you're saying that he's Machal Zera, Kolshkein, she becomes Mechulelos. That's not so. The Zera was born as a Psul, Yitzirasa Avera, through the Avera of Lamazogin, a Kohen Gadol to an Almana, and the child never had Kashrus at all. Masechet Elisha, who says that she, and therefore we have to come up with a Lo Yechul. Tana Rabbana, we learned to the Brisa. Ezu hi Chalol Kol Shenoldo Min Apsul. A girl who was born from any intimacy between a man and the mother, and that intimacy was an Isur Kahuna. My psulim. What does it mean? Nolda min psulim ilem psulim lo. If you're going to say that the Bryce is referring to unfit to marry anyone, which means even a Yisrael, a daughter born from a union between a Yisrael and a woman forbidden to him, and It could be that Isser is not going to generate Mamzerus, by the way, because we're not talking about an Isser Kares, but only an Isser Lav, like Machse Gushaso. Is Hare Machse Gushaso, Dipsulalo, Ubanek Sheret. If a man has an intimacy with his ex after she got married to someone else, and he violates the law of Lo Yuchal Baila Rishon Shashilcha, Loshuv Lekachta Lios Alish Achresha Hutamaki Toevahi, yet the bottom are ksherim. Again, we're talking about a case where the husband is not a Kohen. That's what Rashi always points out here, because the children of a marriage between a Kohen and a Grusha are certainly chalolim. But here, we're talking about a marriage between a Yisrael and his ex-wife. And the Gemara says, the Chsiv, how do we derive this kashrus? The toeva he toeva v'ein boneh toeva. So therefore, it cannot be that when the Brisa says Ezi chalol koshenoldim and apsulim, that it includes any kind of a violation of an iser, psula lo, as we say that in the case of machzir gushaso, because we know in that case the child is kosher. So now the Gemara explains the Brisa. Omer Rabbi Yehuda hachi kamar ezer hi chalol kol shenolda min psul kahuna. Again, it has to do with a union, a relationship of an iser kahuna that generates chalolos. Gemara asks the following: Nolda in lo, nolda lo. Are you telling me that someone who is not born from such a bias iser is not a chalol? Vari almana grusha vizona delo nolda v'kahavya chalola. You see that bias iser itself generates chalolos. If a woman has an intimacy with a Kohen and she herself is either an almana, grusha, or zona, she becomes a chalola, and she cannot marry a Kohen. So what are you telling me, nolda? Only if it's nolda? Ezi chalol kol nolda? That's not so. It's not true to say that chalolos exhausts itself in nolda, because there is chalolos that's generated by bia, even without nolda. Amar Ravachi Kama reinterpret the Brisa. Ezo chalola muskeres shalohoyala shasa kosher klal. Who is mentioned? Again, the Gemara is going to have to explain what that means. Muskeres. Anyway. And lohoisala shasa kosher klal, that's a nolda min apsul kuna. But there is chalolos even in a case where she had a shas kosher. My muskeres, what does the word muskeres mean? Oh, Rav Yitzchak bar Avin achikam. Ezo hi chalola. What is the chalola that the Torah mentions in the pasuk Isha zona v'chalolo yikachu? She'ikara midivrei Torah v'ein tzricha lefarish midivrei sofer. It means that we can see it without having to come on to the Rabbanan to interpret the psukim. We see it in the pasuk itself, kol shenoda min psul kahuna. The Torah says lo yichal zaro, and zaro means that if the mother is also chalola, that's going to be derived from the divrei sofrim. But the plain meaning of the pasuk is a child of a Kohen who was intimate with a woman who's not allowed to marry a Kohen. Tana Rabbanan, we learned in the Brisa, almona eno chayv ela achas. Now we're entering into the sugya of chilukei malchios. When you have gufim mechulakim, shemos mechulakim, we'll go into these concepts as we go along, then it generates many malchus. But if it's the same shem, almana, for example, let's say a woman was married 3 times over. Each time she received a get, So she has a Shem Almana from each of her different husbands. Nevertheless, it's also Shem Isur, and therefore, when a Kohen would have a relation, a Kohen Gadol, would have a relationship with this woman, he doesn't engender 3 sets of Malchus, but rather 1. However, and the same thing applies, Gusha, and Chayav El Achas, a woman who was married 3 times, and she was divorced 3 times, and she's asur to any Kohen, even a Kohen Hedjo. If he has beer with her, he only gets 1 set of Malchus. However, Almano, Grusha, V'chalola Zona, what happens if this woman was married and then widowed, remarried and then divorced? Then she became a chalola by having a relationship with a Kohen who violated the Isur Grusha. And then Zona, she became a Zona by having another illicit relationship with a guy or an Eved, whatever it might be. So now we have to see what's called Isur Mosif. The Almana is only Asura to a Kohen Gadol. When now she became a Grusha through the second marriage, she now becomes extended Isur to include all Kohanim. And if she becomes a Chalola, then there's going to be an Isur Truma. So basically we have to see Bisman Shein Beseder in this particular order. First she was an Almana, then a Grusha, then a Chalola, then a Zona. Then he'll be Chayav for each one of these categories, a separate set of Malchus, because Isur Chalal Isur, in the case of an Isur Mos, is Chayav al Kol Achas. However, let's switch around the order. Zinsov and his Chalav and his Garshim and his Halmala, the exact opposite order, Ein Chayav al Achas. And let's understand why. Omar Mar, Almon, Ein Chayav al Achas, Hay Almon Echidomit. The same woman was married to 3 different men. Each one dropped dead. Is Chayav Ela Achas. I'm sorry. Scratch that. If he had 3 bios with 3 different women, one was the widow of Reuven, another woman was the widow of Shimon, and the third woman that he had bria with was a woman of Levi. Is how can you tell me any chayav achas? Here, there's no reason to say that he shouldn't be chayav for each bia.